Imagine standing in a golden palace walls covered in priceless mirrors, chandeliers dripping with diamonds, royal gowns shimmering under candlelight, and then the smell hits you. Not the scent of roses or royal perfumes, but the stench of rotting flesh, dried sweat, oozing sores, and human waste soaking into the silk-covered floor. Welcome to the real world of royalty, where kings and queens ruled empires but reeked like open graves. You've been lied to by portraits, fairy tales, and costume dramas. Behind every crown was a body caked in filth, hidden under layers of perfume, powder, and denial. In this episode, we reveal the shocking truth about the most powerful people in history: monarchs who went months, even years, without touching water, royals who feared bathing more than war, emperors who stank so badly their servants fainted, queens who chose poison over soap. These weren't peasants without access to cleanliness. These were the richest, most powerful people on earth, choosing to live in their own decay. And trust me, number one will make you rethink every royal fantasy you've ever had. This is not history the way you learned it in school. This is the dark, putrid, horrifying truth of royalty that no one ever talks about. Versailles, a palace of mirrors, gold perfection, and an unbearable stench. Most people imagine Louis XIV, the Sun King, as the radiant embodiment of absolute monarchy, powerful, refined, untouchable. But what if I told you the most dazzling man in Europe also happened to be one of its foulest-smelling creatures? Despite reigning for 72 years, Louis reportedly bathed only twice in his entire life. Not twice a month, not twice a year, twice, period. And no, it wasn't because he lacked access to water. He had fountains bigger than your house and servants whose sole job was to draw baths. But he didn't want them. In fact, he feared them. His royal doctors insisted that bathing opened the pores to disease, and Louis believed them. Instead of water, he relied on clouds of perfume thick enough to choke a horse, and layers of ornate fabric designed not to breathe but to trap. Trap what exactly? Sweat, bacteria, dead skin, pus from open sores. Imagine wearing a velvet cage soaked in your own filth every single day for years. Servants regularly fainted when dressing him. Foreign diplomats gagged mid-conversation. His personal scent was said to be a mixture of decaying flesh and floral oil, a flower blooming from a corpse. And it wasn't just his body. Versailles itself, while jaw-dropping in its visual splendor, was a nightmare of hygiene. There were no proper toilets. Courtiers relieved themselves behind curtains in stairwells, even in fireplaces. Excrement flowed through the gilded halls while incense desperately tried to mask the rot. It was a palace that sparkled like heaven but smelled like hell. But Louis didn't mind. In fact, he leaned into the performance. His body was a symbol. The Sun King was not meant to be mortal. He was meant to be worshipped. And if worship meant ignoring the reek of gangrenous ulcers under silk stockings, then so be it. Louis XIV bathed the world in light while drowning himself in his own rot. And that contradiction, that glorious filth, is what made him more than a king. He became a living myth, one that smelled like death, but ruled like a god. He modernized an empire, built cities from swamps, dragged Russia kicking and screaming into the future. But one thing Peter the Great forgot to bring with him was soap. Peter was a visionary, a warrior, even a shipbuilder, but a clean man, not even close. In fact, he may have been one of the dirtiest monarchs in history, and not just politically. While transforming Russia's military, navy, and cultural identity, Peter rarely bothered to transform his clothes. He wore the same sweat-soaked outfit for days, sometimes weeks, through battles, drunken feasts, and even surgical operations. Yes, he performed surgeries himself, all in the same grimy uniform. The result, a royal scent described as a mix of vodka, iron, and unwashed death. His beard grew into a matted tangle. His fingernails blackened with dirt. His boots reeked of blood and rot. The smell was so potent that one foreign diplomat fainted mid-meeting, not from fear, but from the sheer olfactory violence of the Tsar's presence. And that wasn't a one-off. Visitors frequently left his court gagging behind their gloves. But perhaps the most disturbing part, his filth became fashionable. Peter didn't just neglect hygiene, he normalized it. If the Tsar didn't bathe, then neither did the nobles. If Peter walked into court dripping in his own sweat, so did everyone else. He was a trendsetter of grime, an emperor of stench. It was a silent epidemic, a kingdom where progress spread like wildfire, but soap was treated like contraband. Peter tore down ancient Russian customs, but also trampled personal cleanliness underfoot. His reforms were radical, but his body remained stubbornly medieval. And maybe that's the paradox of Peter. He was a man of contradictions, brutally brilliant, fearlessly forward-thinking. Yet behind the speeches and the reforms stood a figure so rank, so physically overwhelming, that standing near him felt like inhaling history's worst mistake. He didn't just smell bad, he smelled like revolution rot and raw ambition. In the end, Peter the Great may have changed the face of Russia, but he left behind a trail of sweat, filth, and fear that no perfume could ever cover. She was the virgin queen, glorious, untouchable, immortalized in pearls, powdered skin, and fire-red wigs. But step closer, and the mask begins to crack. Behind the alabaster face that ruled an empire was a woman, slowly rotting under her own image. Elisabeth I was not just England's most powerful monarch, she was a living performance. Her face, ghost white and flawless, wasn't skin. It was a paste of white lead makeup applied layer upon layer, day after day, to hide the decay beneath. A poison mask that sealed in sweat oil and filth until it festered. She bathed maybe once a month when she felt it necessary. And often, she didn't. Instead of cleaning her body, she perfected the illusion. Her gowns, so intricate they needed multiple ladies to lace, were rarely washed. Her legendary wigs, towering and red, weren't cleaned either. They were powdered, perfumed, and pinned back into place, trapping the sweat lice and scalp oils of weeks past. Her court was a stage, and Elisabeth the star, cracking, blistering, and bleeding beneath the spotlight. But no one dared speak of it. They couldn't. Because to get too close meant more than political danger, it meant confronting the stench. Chronic migraines, blackened teeth, festering sores. Her doctors tried to treat the damage left by the lead. But how do you heal a queen who refuses to remove the mask? Visitors to court described her as distant, even cold. But distance was part survival. The closer one got to Gloriana, the more overwhelming her scent became. Power radiated from her throne, but so did the odor of decay, a haunting perfume of poisoned sweat and desperation. And yet, that's the tragedy. Elisabeth didn't just rule England. She became England, flawless on the surface, crumbling underneath. Her refusal to wash wasn't laziness, it was obsession. An unrelenting war against age, against weakness, against the natural body itself. She defeated the Spanish Armada, outwitted her rivals, and reshaped a nation. But she couldn't escape her reflection. Behind every portrait was a truth too foul to frame the queen, who looked like marble and smelled like death. She launched Columbus across the ocean, conquered kingdoms, and unified Spain under one crown. But beneath the iron will of Queen Isabella of Castile was a belief so extreme, so revolting, that it rewrote the meaning of royalty. She only bathed twice in her entire life. Once when she was born, and once on her wedding day. After that, water was the enemy. To Isabella, cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was a gateway to damnation. Medieval doctors warned that bathing opened the pores and allowed in sickness, demons, and death. And Isabella believed them. She didn't just avoid the bath, she declared war on water. No soaps, no washing, no rinsing. Just layer upon layer of fabric hiding a decaying temple she called sacred. Her gowns were not simply dresses, they were walls. Thick, heavy, suffocating layers of cloth that stayed on her body for weeks, sometimes months, until they literally fell apart. Underneath her skin became a breeding ground for lice rashes and festering sores. It wasn't uncommon for servants to gag when helping her undress. They burned incense just to stay conscious in her presence. The air around her wasn't holy, it was hazardous. And yet she was revered. Saints don't stink, do they? But Isabella's holiness came with a putrid odor. She was a queen who could order entire cultures to kneel before her, but couldn't stand the touch of water. Imagine a woman so powerful she could fund the conquest of the New World, yet so terrified of a sponge that she let her own body rot beneath layers of religious conviction. There's something deeply haunting about that. a monarch who wrapped herself in divine righteousness but lived in filth, a woman who prayed daily while colonies of fleas made a home in her robes. She smelled like piety and decay, but perhaps that was the point. For Isabella, purity wasn't physical, it was ideological, and if her body had to suffer, if others had to suffer so her soul could remain untouched, so be it. She didn't just rule a kingdom. She embodied a worldview where suffering was sacred, water was wicked, and the crown sat atop a corpse, slowly rotting for heaven. He gave the world one of its most sacred texts, the King James Bible. But the man behind this divine masterpiece was anything but pure. In fact, he may have been one of the most foul-smelling monarchs to ever sit a throne. James I of England, also James VI of Scotland, was a scholar, a poet, a political unifier. But he was also a man plagued by a crippling, obsessive fear of water. Not fear of drowning, fear of bathing. To James, water wasn't cleansing. It was corrosive. He believed it sapped the body's vital energy and opened the soul to death. So he avoided it like poison. Instead of bathing, he built up a fortress of filth. His solution: mountains of unwashed clothing, rivers of cheap cologne, oceans of sweat. He slept fully dressed, sometimes even in his mud-caked boots. His hands were encrusted with dirt, his fingernails black with grime, his breath so foul it was said to choke the pious and wilt nearby flowers. But perhaps most disturbing was his fear of being touched. Courtiers were instructed to maintain distance, not just out of respect, but for survival. His body emitted a stench so potent approaching the king felt like walking into a damp cave lined with rotting wool and moldy cheese. Diplomats described audiences with James as endurance trials. Ministers came armed not with policy, but with scented gloves. And yet this was the man who helped unify two crowns and oversaw the translation of scripture that would define Christianity for centuries. A man hailed as divinely appointed while physically repelling anyone within arm's reach. It's the paradox of James. A ruler who feared death so deeply, he let his own body become a breeding ground for it. A monarch who clung to ritual and religion, but lived in such neglect that his own physicians were horrified. He looked like royalty. He smelled like rot. And that smell wasn't incidental. It was symbolic. James didn't just fear being touched. He feared being exposed. Beneath the velvet robes and grand language was a man decaying in real time, desperate to be revered, but terrified to be seen. He shattered the Catholic Church, married 6 wives, and turned England into his personal playground of power. But behind the golden throne of Henry VIII was a man quite literally rotting from the inside out. And no matter how many palaces he built or heads he chopped, there was one thing he refused to face: a bath. To Henry, water was dangerous. Doctors warned that soaking in it could let in disease, drain vital heat, or worse, make a strong king weak. So instead of cleansing, he covered his skin in ointments, covered his scent in perfume, covered his body in layer upon layer of richly embroidered fabric until the rot beneath had nowhere to go but outward. And rot it did. In his later years, Henry ballooned in size, some say over 400 pounds. His legs ulcerated open wounds that oozed pus and blood into bandages rarely changed. The stench of infection followed him like a shadow. Courtiers often had to hold sweet herbs to their faces just to breathe in his presence. His massive frame sweated constantly beneath velvet and fur, mixing with spoiled food, caught in his beard the sour tang of old wine on his breath and the musky reek of unwashed flesh. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was a royal assault on the senses. But the contradiction is what made it tragic. Here was a man worshipped for his strength, yet imprisoned by his own decay. A king who ruled with absolute power, yet couldn't conquer his own body. His refusal to bathe wasn't laziness, it was fear, denial, superstition. He clung to the illusion of control even as his limbs collapsed under him and his stench cleared rooms before he entered. And still, the image endured. Henry the lion, Henry the warrior. But up close, he was a mountain of flesh wrapped in gold, leaking disease and power in equal measure. That's the dark irony of Henry VIII. The man who tore apart Christendom, who rewrote marriage and monarchy, was too afraid to scrub behind his ears. He didn't just smell like death, he ruled like it. She was the face of 19th century beauty, an ethereal figure with a wasp-thin waist, cascading hair like spun gold, and a face that seemed carved from porcelain. But behind the myth of Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi, as the world adored her, was a secret hidden beneath perfume powder and performance she almost never bathed. Unlike the filth-caked monarchs of the Middle Ages, Sisi's dirt was deliberate, disguised beneath obsessive grooming. She spent hours each day on her hair alone, 3 hours of brushing, oiling, and braiding her ankle-length tresses into perfection. Her body, though, largely untouched by water. Sisi believed that bathing weakened the constitution, drained the body of its vital energies, and opened the door to illness. So she skipped it. Instead, she embraced rituals of illusion. Perfumed lotions, dusting powders, vinegars, and rosewater spritzes coated her skin. Her gowns were masterpieces of tailoring, but also a shield layered barriers between her decaying self and the gaze of the world. Her beauty was iconic, yes, but it was also a mask, one carefully maintained, never washed clean. She was haunted by time, obsessed with youth, terrified of aging. Her entire life became a performance to defy decay, but the very tools she used, corsets, powders, restriction, and denial, were suffocating her. Bathing to Sisi was not rejuvenation, it was surrender. A moment of vulnerability she refused to allow. And yet the contradiction is stark. This was a woman who rode horses for hours each day, who fenced, hiked, and dieted until she was nearly skeletal. She dripped sweat beneath silks and lace, yet refused to cleanse what lay beneath. She anointed herself in ritual, but ignored reality. She looked divine, but smelled like fear. Courtiers whispered, servants knew, and yet no one dared say it out loud. How could they? Sisi wasn't just an empress, she was a fantasy that held an empire together. But fantasies don't sweat. They don't age. They don't rot. Sisi's tragedy wasn't just that she avoided bathing. It was that she built her entire life around the illusion that she didn't need to. Her beauty became a prison of perfume, a porcelain mask hiding the truth, even the fairest flower wilts, when it's never watered. We often look at royalty as the pinnacle of perfection, wealth, beauty, power, immortality. But behind the crowns, the jewels, and the portraits, this story reminds us of something far more universal and far more human: the cost of illusion. These kings and queens were not filthy because they lacked resources. They were filthy because they were trapped by fear, by superstition, by image. And in trying to preserve a perfect mask, they allowed their bodies, and in many cases their souls, to decay. The lesson here isn't just about hygiene, it's about authenticity. In our world today, especially in American culture saturated by social media and curated appearances, we're often pressured to perform, to look successful even when we're exhausted, to smile even when we're in pain, to filter ourselves into something unrecognizable. But as these royals show us, pretending to be flawless doesn't protect us, it isolates us. It corrodes us from the inside out. True strength isn't in appearing perfect. It's in being real. In doing the hard, sometimes messy work of facing what's beneath the surface, whether it's a physical wound or an emotional truth. Because if we don't, we risk becoming like the monarchs of history, admired from a distance, but silently falling apart. Don't just cover the rot, clean it, heal it, face it. That's how empires and people stay alive. If this video made you see royalty in a whole new and much smellier light, drop a comment below. Tell us which royal shocked you the most. Don't forget to hit that save button so you can revisit the madness anytime, and if you love dark history as much as we do, make sure to subscribe. We've got more untold stories, twisted truths, and forgotten horrors coming your way. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's next.